My name is Evelyn Hart. I was 27 when everything changed. The call came at 12:17 a.m. Outside my apartment window, rain drifted across the streetlights in silver sheets. I had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day at work, surrounded by scattered papers and a mug of cold tea. When my phone lit up, I almost ignored it. Then I saw Lily's name. My 8-year-old niece. I answered immediately. Aunt Evie. Her voice trembled. The sound jolted me fully awake. Lily? What's wrong? For a moment, she didn't answer. I could hear soft breathing. A sniffle. Then another. I'm hungry. The words seemed strangely small, yet they landed with unbearable weight.
Hungry.
Not frightened. Not injured.
Hungry.
I sat upright. Where are Grandma and Grandpa? I don't know. Her answer came too quickly, like she had already asked herself that question many times. A knot formed in my stomach. Lily had been living with my parents for almost a year while my older sister, Rachel, completed an overseas contract. Every family update suggested everything was fine. Perfect, even. My mother sent cheerful photos. My father posted proud messages online. Birthday cakes. School projects. Smiling faces. Yet something in Lily's voice felt painfully different from those pictures. When did you last eat? I asked softly. Another pause. I don't remember. I closed my eyes. Children don't answer that way unless they're trying to be careful. And children should never have to be careful about food. I'm coming right now, I said. Aunt Evie? Yes. Her voice became almost a whisper. Please don't tell Grandma I called. The rain continued tapping against my window, but suddenly the apartment felt completely silent. And I knew this night was about to uncover something none of us were prepared to face. I grabbed my keys and left without changing out of my work clothes. The drive to my parents' house usually felt familiar. I had made that trip hundreds of times growing up. That night, it felt completely different. The roads were nearly empty. Rain slid across the windshield in restless patterns while Lily's voice replayed inside my head. Please don't tell Grandma I called. The sentence bothered me more than anything else. Children keep secrets when they're planning surprises. Or when they're afraid. Neither possibility brought me comfort. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway. The house stood exactly as I remembered it. The porch light glowed warmly. Flower pots lined the front steps. Everything looked normal, but appearances had fooled me before. As I approached the front door, I noticed something strange. The kitchen light was off. So was the living room. The house seemed unusually dark. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. A growing unease settled in my chest. Finally, I used the spare key hidden beneath the stone planter near the porch. The same hiding place my parents had used for years. Inside, the air felt cold. Not physically cold. Emotionally cold. The kind of silence that immediately tells you something is wrong. Evelyn, a small voice called from upstairs. Lily, I'm in my room. Relief washed over me. At least she was safe. I hurried up the staircase. When I opened her bedroom door, my heart tightened. She sat curled beneath a blanket, hugging a stuffed rabbit I had given her years ago. Her blonde hair was messy. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes. But it wasn't her appearance that unsettled me. It was her expression. Children usually brighten when someone they love arrives. Lily looked relieved, as if she had been waiting for rescue. I knelt beside her bed. Sweetheart, what happened? She glanced toward the hallway before answering. That small movement told me more than words ever could. Then she whispered. They said I was being dramatic. I frowned. Who did? Her eyes lowered to the rabbit in her lap. Grandma and Grandpa. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't about one missed dinner. It was about something far bigger. And Lily had been carrying it alone. I sat beside Lily on the bed while rain tapped softly against the window. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I didn't want to rush her. Children often reveal the truth in their own time. Lily, I said gently, can you tell me what happened tonight? She stared at the stuffed rabbit's worn ears. I asked if there was anything to eat. And Her fingers tightened around the toy. Grandma said, "I already had enough today." Something about the way she repeated the sentence made it sound memorized. Not recent. Repeated. I felt a quiet ache in my chest. "Did you?" She shook her head. Slowly. "No." The room fell silent again. I noticed things I should have noticed sooner. A stack of school books neatly arranged in the corner. Drawings taped carefully to the wall. A small desk with perfect rows of pencils. Everything looked organized. Too organized. As if Lily had learned not to take up space. Not to make noise. Not to ask for too much. I remembered the little girl who used to cover entire tables with crayons and glitter. The child who laughed so loudly that strangers smiled. The girl sitting beside me felt older somehow. Not in years. In weight. Emotional weight. "Does this happen often?" I asked. She hesitated. Then nodded. The answer hit harder than I expected. Because neglect rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly. In missed meals. Dismissed feelings. Unanswered questions. Tiny moments nobody else sees. Moments that eventually teach a child they matter less. I swallowed carefully. "When was the last time you talked to your mom?" Lily's face changed immediately. A shadow crossed it. 3 weeks ago." I blinked. "What?" "Grandma says Mom is busy." 3 weeks. Rachel called her daughter almost every day. At least she used to. Something wasn't adding up. Then Lily climbed off the bed and walked to her desk. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a small notebook. A purple one covered with faded stars. She handed it to me. I wrote things down. I opened the first page. And within seconds, my heartbeat began to rise. Because this wasn't a child's diary. It was a record. A careful record of things nobody wanted anyone else to see. My hands felt strangely unsteady as I opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Not perfect. Not adult. Just the careful writing of a child trying very hard to remember important things. At the top of the first page, Lily had written, "Things I don't want to forget." A knot tightened in my throat. I turned the page. There were dates. Short notes. Tiny observations. Some only a sentence long. Grandma said I was selfish for asking for seconds. Grandpa said Mom worries too much and doesn't need to know everything. I wasn't allowed to call Aunt Evie because it wasn't an emergency. I kept reading. Each entry alone seemed small, but together they formed a pattern. A pattern that was impossible to ignore. Not cruelty. Not dramatic abuse. Something quieter. Something that often hides in plain sight. Control. The notebook wasn't documenting a single terrible event. It was documenting months of being dismissed. Months of being unheard. Months of being treated like an inconvenience instead of a child. I looked up. "When did you start writing this?" Lily shrugged. "A long time ago." "Why?" She thought for a moment, then answered with heartbreaking simplicity. "So, I'd know I wasn't imagining it." The room seemed to stop around me. Because no 8-year-old should ever feel the need to collect evidence of their own feelings. I closed the notebook carefully. My parents had always valued appearances. Growing up, everything had to look perfect from the outside. Good grades, clean clothes, polite smiles. Problems were discussed privately, if they were discussed at all. Suddenly, memories I hadn't thought about in years began resurfacing. Mom telling me I was too sensitive. Dad saying I should stop making everything a big deal. I had spent years convincing myself those moments were normal. Now I wasn't so sure. A floorboard creaked somewhere downstairs. Lily immediately stiffened. The reaction was instant, automatic, learned. Someone had just come home. And whatever truth had been hidden inside this house for months was about to step through the front door. For the first time that night, I wasn't just worried. I was ready to ask questions. And this time, I wasn't leaving without answers. The sound of the front door echoed through the house. A few seconds later, I heard familiar voices downstairs. My parents. Lily's shoulders immediately tensed. That reaction alone told me more than any explanation could. I placed the notebook gently on her desk. "Stay here for a minute," I said. She nodded but looked nervous. As I walked downstairs, memories followed me. The polished family photos lining the hallway. The carefully arranged decorations. The same house that had always seemed warm to visitors. Yet suddenly I couldn't stop noticing how much energy had gone into making everything appear perfect. My mother was hanging her coat near the entryway when she saw me. Evelyn. Surprise flashed across her face. Then confusion. What are you doing here? I looked at both of them. I got a phone call. My father's expression changed slightly. A phone call? From Lily. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. My mother recovered first. Oh, goodness. She woke you over that. Over that. The words landed heavily. Not concern. Not curiosity. Dismissal. I kept my voice calm. She told me she was hungry. Mom sighed. The kind of sigh adults use when they think they're dealing with an unreasonable complaint. Children exaggerate. I remembered the notebook upstairs. The pages. The dates. The careful notes. And suddenly I realized how often Lily had probably heard that sentence. Children exaggerate. You're being dramatic. You're too sensitive. Words that slowly teach someone to doubt themselves. My father folded his arms. We've sacrificed a lot caring for her. I know, I said. And I appreciate that. That part was true. This wasn't about accusing anyone. It was about understanding what had happened. But when I mentioned that Lily hadn't spoken to Rachel in weeks, both of them exchanged a glance. A very brief glance, yet impossible to miss. Something inside me sharpened immediately. Why did you look at each other like that? Neither answered right away. The silence stretched. Then my mother walked toward the kitchen and quietly said, "Some conversations are more complicated than children need to hear." My stomach tightened. Because that wasn't an answer. It was avoidance. And for the first time that night, I began to wonder if the biggest secret in this house had nothing to do with food at all. Maybe Lily hadn't been kept in the dark by accident. Maybe someone had been controlling what she knew. And what Rachel knew too. I followed my mother into the kitchen. The room looked exactly as it always had. The same wooden table. The same curtains over the sink. The same clock ticking steadily on the wall. Yet everything felt different. Sometimes a place changes the moment you begin seeing it clearly. What conversations? I asked. My mother busied herself, wiping an already clean countertop. A habit she had whenever she felt uncomfortable. It's complicated, Evelyn. No, I replied quietly. Complicated and secret aren't the same thing. The clock continued ticking. My father remained near the doorway, unusually silent. That silence worried me more than an argument would have. Finally, my mother spoke. Rachel has been under a lot of stress. I know. She was calling too often. I stared at her. What does that mean? My mother sighed. It means every conversation upset Lily. The explanation felt incomplete. Carefully edited. As though important pieces had been removed. I thought about Rachel. My older sister wasn't perfect. But she adored her daughter. Every decision she made revolved around Lily. The idea that she would suddenly stop calling made no sense. Unless she hadn't stopped. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 months earlier, Rachel had texted me. Have you talked to Lily lately? She seems distant during our calls. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Now the message felt different. Important. I pulled out my phone and searched for it. There it was. Still sitting in our old conversation. My pulse quickened. Rachel thought Lily was becoming distant. Neither parent responded. That was answer enough. A terrible possibility began forming in my mind. What exactly happens during their phone calls? Again silence. Then my father finally spoke. His voice sounded tired. Not angry. Just tired. Your mother thought it would be easier if some calls were shortened. I blinked. What? Only when Lily seemed emotional. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't process the words. Shortened. Not missed. Not delayed. Controlled. My thoughts immediately returned to the notebook upstairs. Grandma says Mom is busy. A sentence repeated often enough eventually becomes reality. At least to a child. And suddenly I realized what Lily had been documenting. Not isolated incidents. a pattern, a slow rewriting of her world. A world where her feelings became inconveniences and her questions became problems. The rain outside had finally stopped, but inside that kitchen, another storm was beginning, because someone needed to know the truth. And that someone was Rachel. I didn't wait until morning. At nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, I stepped onto the back porch and called Rachel. The air smelled of wet soil and rain-soaked grass. Water dripped from the roof in slow, steady rhythms. For a few seconds, the phone rang. Then I heard her voice. Evelyn. She sounded surprised and exhausted. Rachel, I need to ask you something. The silence on the other end immediately told me she sensed something was wrong. Is Lily okay? That question alone made my chest tighten. Not how are mom and dad. Not what's happening. Only, is Lily okay? She's safe, I said carefully. I heard Rachel exhale. Then she whispered, Thank God. There was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Fear. Not panic. Not anxiety. Fear that had been building quietly over time. Rachel, I asked softly, how often have you been talking to Lily? A long pause followed. Not much lately. Why? Because she never seems interested anymore. The sadness in her voice was unmistakable. Every call feels rushed. Sometimes she barely talks. Other times I can't reach her at all. I closed my eyes. The pieces were finally connecting. Rachel thought Lily was pulling away. Lily thought Rachel was too busy to call. Both believed the other had changed. Neither knew what the other had been told. And between them stood months of filtered conversations, shortened calls, and carefully controlled information. Not because anyone wanted to be cruel, but because someone believed they knew what was best. And in trying to control emotions, they had damaged trust. When I explained everything, Rachel became completely silent. For several seconds, all I heard was breathing. Then she spoke, very quietly. I knew something felt wrong. The words carried no anger, only heartbreak. The kind that comes when a suspicion you've tried to dismiss finally becomes real. Inside the house, I could see my parents through the kitchen window. Older than I remembered. More fragile. Suddenly, this stopped feeling like a story about villains. It felt like a story about mistakes. Painful mistakes. And now all of us would have to decide what came next, because the truth had finally surfaced, and none of us could pretend not to see it anymore. The hardest part wasn't uncovering the truth. The hardest part was sitting with it afterward. A week later, Rachel flew home. I still remember the afternoon she arrived. The sky was clear. Sunlight spilled through the living room windows, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the air. Everything looked peaceful, yet everyone sitting in that room knew something important had changed. Lily sat beside her mother on the couch, holding her hand tightly. Not because she was afraid, because she didn't want to let go. Rachel listened quietly as the notebook was placed on the table. Page by page, entry by entry. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Nobody tried to explain things away. For once, the silence was honest. My mother's eyes filled with tears before the notebook was halfway finished. My father stared at the floor. Neither looked defensive, only heartbroken. And perhaps that was the most painful realization of all. They had never intended to hurt Lily. They believed they were protecting her from stress, protecting Rachel from worry, protecting the family from conflict. But good intentions do not erase consequences. Sometimes love becomes control when it stops listening. Sometimes protection becomes isolation when it removes someone's voice. And sometimes the people who care about us most can still make mistakes that leave lasting scars. That afternoon, nobody won. Nobody lost. There was no dramatic confrontation. No perfect apology. No magical solution. Only truth. And truth, it turns out, is both painful and necessary. Over the following months, things changed slowly, the way real healing usually does. Rachel moved back permanently. Lily no longer needed to keep records in secret notebooks. Phone calls became open conversations. Questions were answered instead of dismissed. Feelings were acknowledged instead of corrected. The purple notebook remained, not as evidence, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that even quiet voices deserve to be heard, sometimes especially the quiet ones. A year later, I found that same notebook sitting on a shelf in Rachel's home. Beside it was a recent drawing Lily had made. A picture of 4 people sitting around a table. Talking. Smiling. Listening. Nothing extraordinary. Yet I stood there looking at it for several minutes. Because after everything that had happened, I finally understood something. Families are not held together by appearances. Not by perfect photographs. Not by carefully managed stories. They survive through honesty, through uncomfortable conversations, through the courage to admit when we are wrong, and through the decision to listen before someone has to cry for help at midnight. Sometimes justice is not revenge. Sometimes justice is simply allowing the truth to enter a room where silence has lived for far too long. And sometimes that truth becomes the very thing that gives a family a second chance. Some wounds are created not by cruelty, but by being unheard. This story reminds us that children often communicate their struggles in quiet ways, and the people who listen can change everything. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever discovered a family truth that changed your perspective? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more emotional, cinematic stories that explore resilience, healing, and the power of truth.